Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to make an easy carved wood waving American flag. I'm using 3 pipe vices. These are very inexpensive. I got these down at Home Depot a few years back when I was making some cutting boards. And I'm going to clamp all of the pieces horizontal. This is going to be basically the size of the flag that we're going to end up with. This is probably the most important tool. It cost me about $15 for this wood carving disc that mounted onto any standard 4.5-inch angle grinder. This thing is a beast. It removes a lot of material very quickly. Use a very light touch. And you want to grind just with the tip of it. If you let the base touch, it will grab and move on you. But with a very little bit of practice, you can control it pretty nicely. I've done a lot of wood grinding, mostly with flap sanding wheels, but this was the first time I used a grinding disc like this, and really pleased with it. Just remove the material very quickly. You don't have to be an artist. You want to grind down so that the thickness of the board is about a 1/2 inch thick at the least amount, the bottom of the groove. Because you got to leave a little bit of room to sand these grooves smooth, not only with a flap sanding wheel, but then also with an oscillating sander. And you want to end up with wood that's somewhere in the 3/8 thickness. Probably took me a half hour to rough shape the entire flag. And now on the other end, and you can see how you can still see some flats in between the grooves. When you're doing the rest of the grinding, whether it be with the flap sanding wheel or the oscillating sander, this is the flap sanding wheel, you want to make sure you get rid of all of those flats, that you round over all of the edges so that it's really just curves. Now, the flap sanding wheel that I'm using is very worn. In fact, it was almost completely worn out. A good one, an 80 grit flap sanding wheel would smooth out all of these rough grind lines very, very quickly. I ended up using just an oscillating sander with an 80 grit disc on it. And it probably took me a little bit longer than it would have, if I had a fresh flap sanding wheel, but it still did the job relatively quickly. You can see here some of those deep gouges made by the first disc, and how quickly that 80 grit paper smooths everything over. So I sanded everything with an 80 grit, then I went to a 120, and then I real quickly went over everything with a 220. And of course I spent the majority of the time with the 80. And you can see that the flag is starting to take shape now. So the con, or the downside of using 1x2s is you're definitely not going to end up with a flag that has as deep curves or waves as you would with thicker wood, like a 2x4. But I think you're going to end up with a really nice piece, and it's certainly going to look like a carved wood flag should look. I highlighted the depth of each one of those depressions just by adding a little bit of darkness with a torch. There's also a bunch of variety of ways that you can finish these things. You can paint them, you can stain them, you can use a combination of paint and stain. That's all individual preference. What I've done now is I put a little bit of painter's tape on each white stripe, and I'm going to remove all of the white stripes and just move them out of the way so I don't make any mistakes. I'm going to use red stain to stain all of the red boards. Before I do that, I marked the length of the union, the blue area, and I'm just going to hammer in a razor blade on each board, on each of the 3 or 4 boards up top that line up with the union. This is an attempt to keep the stain from running onto the area that's going to be blue. This works really well if you're painting, but really stain, it's really hard to keep from seeping through. But I'm going to do it anyway. we're going to make our own red stain. I had some very light wood stain. I'm just going to, pour a little bit. There's no magic formula here. A little bit into a container. I did go out and buy some oil-based red paint. Doesn't matter what kind of paint you get, as long as it's oil-based. You can add that right into the wood stain and then stir it up. And you're creating, this way, your own red stain. That stain is going to drag the color deep into the wood so that after you stain it and wipe it off, you should be able to see the wood grain, which is really what I'm looking for. If you painted this, you might as well just paint a piece of plywood. You just don't have the character that you would have if you can see the grain through the stain. On the red stripes, both top and bottom, you do want to do the edges because you are going to end up seeing those. The inside edge, you really just, the first quarter of an inch or so has to have some stain on it, just so that when we finally glue these things together, if one isn't lined up completely, you're not going to see any of the white wood through it. Now, the plain wood, the white pieces, you can leave plain, or you could stain them with a very, very light stain, or you could even whitewash them. Or, as I mentioned before, you could paint them white, your choice. After I wiped off all of the excess stain, I'm going to let these dry completely. But you can see the wood grain through the stain. And that's what I was looking for. So now I'm going to assemble all of the pieces. I'm just using wood glue. I placed all of the pieces back onto the pipe clamps. I'm going to run wood glue down each piece. And then when I put the next piece on, I'm just going to line it up end to end so that they're as even as possible. You can't be perfect with this stuff, but you just try to do the best you can. I was surprised at how quickly this whole project went. Even with the drying time, the stain and the glue, I got this whole thing done in 2 days. And really, added up, it was really just maybe 2.5 hours worth of work. Most of the time was spent drying time. Once the final piece is glued and in position, you just going to want to tighten up, each one of those 3 clamps and walk away from it, let it dry. This is probably the most important step. This is the one I wasn't so sure that these 1x2s would hold together when gluing them together horizontally rather than vertically. Anyway, all the glue that squeezed out, I wiped off the majority with a paper towel, and then I used a moistened rag to get off any excess glue. And now the flag is really starting to take shape. And it's going to get better than this. So I'm going to lay all of these stars in position, then I'm going to spray paint over them the background of the Union, and then I'm going to peel each one of these stars. I did end up using some of that light stain on all of the white stripes and the white area. This is a dark blue. It was a navy blue spray paint that I found at, I think this one I got at Ace Hardware. I spray this on. I've taped off all areas of the flag that I didn't want to be dark blue. And I walked away from that and let it dry completely. And then I'm just going to use a tweezer and I'm just going to peel off each one of those stars. Now, if you wanted light stars, like I said, you could paint that whole area white, then put the stars on, then paint it blue, and then when you peeled the stars, it would show white underneath it. The other option would be to paint the entire area blue and then get one of the stencils that you can get on Etsy and then just paint the white stars through the stencil. Final step or final process, I'm just going to spray some high gloss clear lacquer over the entire flag, and I ended up doing a couple of coats. And this is the finished product. So you got wood grain that you can see through the stars, as well as all of the white stripes. You've got 13 stripes red, both top and bottom.